Today, we are going to undercomplicate the topic of domestic violence, and we have a wonderful guest with us, Dr. Shannon Goecke-Watson. Welcome to Undercomplicating Stuff, where we, two psychologists and coaches with over 40 years of combined experience, share our insights to help undercomplicate important topics. A reminder that this video is meant for conversational and entertainment purposes only. Please see the information section of this video for additional resources, including those about today's topic. So I'm Dr. Julie Radico. I am a psychologist, a coach, an author, and a speaker, and I'm here with my co-host, Dr. Gideon.
Stacey Gideon. I'm a health psychologist and the founder and CEO of a healthcare consulting and professional coaching business. And now let's have our guest introduce herself. Please, Shannon.
My name is Dr. Shannon Goecke-Watson. I'm a licensed psychologist located in Apple Valley, Minnesota. I exclusively treat survivors of domestic violence. I come from a background of being a domestic violence shelter advocate, a court advocate, a police station advocate, hospital visits, things of that nature. I love that work so much. I went back and got a master's and doctorate degree in psychology to be able to treat the after effects of domestic violence in the therapy office.
Thank you so much for being here and for all the important work that you do. It's unfortunately very much needed, and we're hoping to learn a lot from you today. One of the questions we always like to ask is, what might be some myths or misconceptions that people have about domestic violence?
One of the most common myths associated with domestic violence is this idea if there's no bruise, there's no abuse. And that is absolutely, without a doubt, not true. There are many different forms of domestic violence that exist. You have psychological abuse and emotional abuse. Most often people try to equate the two as the same, but the reality is they're different. Psychological abuse is where somebody tries to target somebody's cognitions or their beliefs, calls names, things of that nature, which differs from emotional abuse, which is where somebody's specifically targeting abuse associated with emotions, so doing things like trying to induce guilt. Another really common myth that I regularly hear and encounter is that men are always the perpetrators and women are always the victims. No, that is not true. At this point, the most recent resources indicate that about 1 out of 3 women experience domestic violence and 1 out of 7 men also experience domestic violence. So this isn't necessarily just the experience that men perpetrate, women are survivors. We also know that in same-sex couples, the rates of DV are actually pretty similar. So it is very much a myth to think that one gender is responsible and one gender is never responsible. Another one that I regularly hear is that domestic violence is a crime of the poor and uneducated, which is not true. We know that domestic violence occurs to, goodness, every population in the world. We've not yet found a population where it doesn't exist, and socioeconomic status is certainly no exclusion to that. Another one that I regularly hear, and this is one I dispel a lot with my clients, which is if somebody doesn't leave, it really must not be that bad, which is very much untrue. There are a number of reasons people don't leave, and love is only one of them. It's not the only reason. Another one that happens is this idea that people who abuse must just not be able to control frustration or anger, which is why it actually ends up being reperpetrated by the courts. The courts regularly refer them to go do things like anger management. In my office, we actually talk about the fact that anger management is the inappropriate term. It ought to actually be called aggression management, because it's not that you're learning to manage the emotion, it's that you're learning to manage the behaviors behind the emotion. But domestic violence can also be perpetrated even when it's not necessarily about aggression. Things, for example, like financial abuse happen beyond the indications of frustration, rage, anger, etc. From a therapeutic perspective, it's important to be aware that there's a myth out there that couples counseling is the answer and the key to stopping abuse. And that actually oftentimes is not true. What we actually know instead, and what the truth behind that is that couples therapy can often be used as a weapon against the person who's enduring abuse. We'll see the person who is trying to take power and control use aspects of therapy from couples therapy and use it to continue to perpetrate harm, which is really concerning. And then last but not least, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the myth that states it's not sexual abuse if you're married. That is without a doubt a myth. We know that rape and sexual abuse can happen in the context of any relationship, including marriage.
I want to highlight one of the things that you said, that anger is different than aggression. So, as human beings, we experience emotions all the time, and anger is not a bad emotion inherently. It can turn into aggression if we're not able to soothe ourselves and regulate it. Though the fact that we get angry, you get angry every day for lots of different things. It's part of being human. But the difference and the importance in noticing the difference between I'm angry versus like somebody's acting aggressively at me, and that going to anger management classes might not be fitting the bill if it's really not dealing with like that action, that ability to like hold the detrimental harm that's done. Wondering if and there's probably not an easy answer here, but if somebody's listening and they're thinking about themselves, they're thinking about a loved one, how might they know that domestic violence, intimate partner violence, that's happening?
That is another really, really great question. The reality is there's a spectrum of abuse. We have a very, very overt side of the spectrum. We have a very, very covert side of the spectrum. The overt side of the spectrum is much more obvious to the general person. Most of us can pick it up. It's what those Lifetime movies look like. The overt side of the spectrum is going to look like being kicked, hit, punched, pushed, shoved from a physical abuse perspective. From a financial abuse perspective, it's going to look like not having access to any funds, or from an isolation perspective, it's being told you can't leave the house, things of that nature. From an emotional or psychological perspective, terroristic threats, things of that nature. That's going to be that overt side of abuse. The opposite side of the spectrum actually becomes harder often to pick up. And here's where we get to the more covert side of the spectrum. The covert side of the spectrum becomes easy for us to invalidate in ourselves, which is part of what makes it really, really difficult to pick up. It's easy to be able to say, well, I don't know that my partner or my family member said that with poor intention, but I'm not sure that that felt good. Or sometimes what ends up happening is they're actually validating the insecurities we already have about ourselves. So we actually take it as a good thing that somebody else can see the flaws in us. And so examples of that more covert side of the spectrum look like getting a look from across the room, a look that you know what it means, but nobody else knows what it means, but it means bad things for you when you leave that particular room. It also can look like all of a sudden there's no funds to support my hobbies. There's funds to support your hobbies, but we don't have the funds to be able to support my hobbies from the financial abuse perspective. From the emotional and psychological perspective, it can be things like not so much necessarily the name calling, which is an act of domestic violence, but again, more of that validation of the insecurities that I already have. So, for example, if I'm poking and prodding at my thighs in the mirror and going, I don't love my thighs, and my partner walks up and goes, yeah, a few more squats might be helpful. At first glance, that might not look like domestic violence, but at the end of the day, that is an act of power and control. It is to try to start taking power and control in the context of that relationship, and that becomes concerning. Even with physical abuse, we see much more covert sides of that spectrum. If I continue to be touched by my partner in a way that I've asked them not to touch me, and they're doing it despite the wishes that I've expressed to them that I don't want it, that does become to the point where it becomes covert abuse. Now, I'm often asked about what's the line between what's just deemed unhealthy relationship behaviors and what becomes abusive. And how I regularly answer that to my clients is by saying, number one, what's the purpose behind the behavior? Is it about taking power and control? And number two, does it become a repeated pattern? Domestic abuse is really about a repeated pattern, particularly for the purposes of taking power and control. So there isn't necessarily a line if somebody did this 3 times, but 4 makes it abuse, but it really is to that point where we start noticing those pervasive patterns.
Thank you so much for talking about the continuum. And I agree. I think a lot of people think of the Lifetime movies or the other really obvious indicators, and pointing out what is more covert is really, really helpful. Earlier, you mentioned that there are lots of reasons why people stay in relationships where there might be domestic violence, and that love was just one of them. Can you expand a little bit more on why people might stay in relationships that are experiencing domestic violence?
There are many really reasons why individuals stay in relationships beyond just love. I don't want to negate that love is certainly one of those, but it isn't the only answer. And it often looks like it is the only answer, but that's not true. One of the most common reasons why individuals stay in abusive relationships is fear. We know that in the process of leaving an abusive relationship, we actually know that's the period of time where somebody's safety is at the biggest threat, which is seriously concerning. Fear doesn't necessarily just have to be associated with safety related issues either. It can be fear of things like being reported to law enforcement for immigration. It could be fear of living alone, which can be really scary for a lot of people. Fear of not being able to financially support ourselves. Fear of what will happen to our pets or our kids if we leave. You would not imagine how many people were their pets, not just their kids, but also their pets actually become a really big barrier to leaving. There are many other reasons, like I mentioned, finances is another good one. For some people, they don't have the ability to support themselves. Individuals with disabilities also face unique challenges, particularly those with physical disabilities. If the individual who is harming them in some way is their primary caretaker, possibly even being paid for being their primary caretaker, that adds a whole nother layer of complication where choosing to leave could be really, really difficult. I always tell clients in my office the reality is there's as many reasons to leave as there are as many reasons to stay.
This is a really heavy, complex topic that doesn't have easy answers to it. And I am mindful that most people who know somebody who's been through domestic violence type of relationship, they've wanted to just like take that loved one, that person, and be like, just leave. And it's so easy to say, and sometimes for all these complex reasons that you've named, hard to do. I'm curious then, kind of like putting on my psychologist hat, I think about like how do you step into like prevention? Because we started talking about like, all right, you're already in this relationship. What might be the risk factors, some of the reasons people might stay. I'm wondering if from your experience, there are warning signs or things that people could be thinking about as they're like starting relationships, things that maybe aren't like perfect one-to-one indicators that this is going to turn into a unhealthy or abusive relationship, maybe things that you want to make sure you're having good thoughtful conversations about or exploring or not just ignoring. Like what might some of those warning signs be?
Right now, it is very pop culture to talk about red flags, yellow flags, and green flags. So, to use that language. So, I'm going to go ahead today and use the concept of red flags because I think that that's an important construct here. And probably one that for a lot of people really resonates. So there are a number of early relationship red flags. One that I see regularly when doing this type of work is people who want somebody to commit to a relationship faster than they feel ready. So they're being pressured to identify as monogamous, or they're being pressured to identify as boyfriend, girlfriend, or partners. They're even being pressured to move in together, to get married, whatever it happens to be. So if you're finding that you're experiencing somebody pushing you at a rate that you're not feeling comfortable, I ask you to please make sure that you listen to that into yourself. Another one that is a relationship red flag is somebody who talks really negatively about past partners. Now, this becomes complicated because a lot of people think, well, my ex is a jerk. But if somebody is truly speaking derogatory, that becomes a really big red flag. I actually would add to that as well. Another red flag is somebody that speaks terribly about the gender of whoever you happen to be. So if you're male and somebody's absolutely speaking derogatory about males or non-binary individuals or females or whoever it happens to be, that also becomes a red flag. If you're feeling pressured to engage in physical acts that you're maybe not ready for, or things that make you physically feel uncomfortable, things even like holding somebody's hand needs to be done at a pace that feels comfortable. Another one would be an indicator of somebody who is making decisions for us without consulting us. I've had folks share with me on numerous occasions, for example, they've been at restaurants where the person has ordered on their behalf and they weren't able to have a say in what they were able to have for dinner, which is concerning. Again, it seems pretty subtle. It seems like maybe somebody's trying to step up and really help out. But at the end of the day, it's taking somebody's autonomy away, which is really concerning. If you have somebody who is physically engaging in aggressive behaviors toward other objects, walls, etc., that would be another red flag to be mindful of. So often we think about, well, somebody is going to punch me, but the reality is even things like punching a wall, punching a pillow, or shoving something out of the way in an aggressive manner tends to be a pretty big red flag. If you're talking and sharing your opinions and your opinions are being questioned and hammered back, now this is different than polite discussion where we can have different views and be able to talk about why our views are different. And at the end of the day, it's okay that we both get our different views. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about you're feeling pressure to have to change your view. You don't get a right to have your own view. You're being told your view is wrong or that you're wrong or it doesn't matter. Another one that's really popular right now is frequency of communication. I am so often hearing from individuals that they're being pushed to communicate at times where it's not necessarily comfortable or rates at which aren't comfortable for them. So a lot of us like the idea of being able to check in throughout the day. And if that's what you and the other individual have agreed upon works for you, great. That's a great open conversation. But if you're finding that you're getting a lot of frequent communication or you put boundaries down and just flat out said, hey, I don't have the time to do this, or I'm at work, or my boss isn't okay with this, or I'm not okay with this, which I hope you feel comfortable saying. But if that's not being respected, that's seriously concerning. Also, if somebody's asking to see your social media, your private messages, your text messages, your media to be able to communicate that, that's also concerning. It doesn't matter what relationship we're in, boundaries are applicable. I don't know a relationship that exists in which boundaries are important, and privacy certainly fits in with those particular boundaries. So please know you have a right to privacy no matter where you're at in a relationship and no matter how long you've been with a partner.
Thank you so much for explaining that. And it reminds me of, again, a continuum. And you really highlighted some of the things that may not be so obvious to people or things that they may sort of minimize or say, well, it's not that big of a deal until maybe it becomes more frequent or more intense. I'm wondering, and I'm mindful that it will vary depending upon the situation and there isn't a one size fits all. What would be some suggestions you might give to someone if they're thinking, okay, I think I might be in a situation where there's some domestic violence, and what are my options? What can I do?
I will tell you, I automatically, number one, will always default to physical safety, ensuring that somebody's physical safety is maintained. So there are a lot of different ways to maintain somebody's physical safety. If you in any way suspect you are physically unsafe, please make sure that you call 911 if needed, contact law enforcement. Please, without a doubt, I cannot overemphasize that. I do also recommend experiencing and connecting in with a local domestic violence shelter or with an advocacy agency. Individuals that are advocates have the ability to be able to understand different protections that are out there. They have the ability to safety plan with individuals. Safety plans are often necessary. Even if you are working with somebody who may not necessarily have experienced acts of physical violence, it doesn't change that safety planning still becomes necessary. There's some very easy, very basic safety planning that anybody has the capability of doing. Off the top of my head, something that I recommend regularly to my clients for safety planning is that they have text emoji picked out with somebody where if they text this particular emoji, it means that, go pick up my kids. If you get this emoji, it means call 911 to my house, things of that nature. Again, don't pick common emojis. Don't pick the ones like the happy face or the heart for those particular. They need to be some pretty obscure ones. I also don't recommend picking the black flag, white flag, red flag, as that looks pretty obvious that if somebody got it hold of your phone, that would be a bit scary. Pick some emoji that's a lot more obscure, a lot harder to be able to detect. Have an identified safe person with whom you can share that and they know what each of those particular emojis mean. So again, safety planning, safety, physical safety is always going to be number one for me. Other thing for somebody that is trying to leave is to be able to research protection orders if necessary. Also researching knowledgeable divorce attorneys or separation attorneys or child family court attorneys that understand domestic violence. There are a number of individuals who claim to understand the construct of domestic violence, particularly in the legal field, where just because somebody puts something on their website doesn't always necessarily mean they're really understanding it. So I really encourage people to do a good, thorough interview of a potential attorney just before you sign to make sure it is somebody that understands and knows how to best help you in your circumstance. If you're less worried about your physical safety, I do always recommend to clients, if you're in the process of wanting to break up with a partner, make sure you do any type of breakups in a public place. Public breakups make it less likely for a person to get to the point where they would escalate to physical violence in space where they could easily be intervened with. So I seriously consider in intimate partner situations for those breakups, I highly urge people to go into public places to do them. Afterwards, I always recommend to individuals to be mindful not to go immediately home or to immediately to the location where somebody would know you are. So after the public breakup, go to a friend's house, go shopping, go do whatever it is. But immediately going home is not always in the best interest of the individual. Even if it feels hard, it feels emotional to do these breakups, it is important to ensure that you're going to be in a space that wouldn't be predictable.
I appreciate the thoughtful resources that you shared. And I'm curious, I hope you correct me if I'm wrong here, that something that I learned was that the most dangerous time for somebody in a domestic violence relationship is after you leave the relationship.
That is correct. It's actually in the process of leaving. Yeah. And we also know now this is gendered, and I will own that this is gendered because I don't have research from other genders, but we do know for women that the average woman actually ends up going back to an abusive relationship 7 times. So if you are somebody who has broke up with a partner and has gone back to them, I just want to first off to normalize that. And second of all, to let you know that you're not alone in that.
Yeah, I think there's so much shame and blame and guilt that can come along with being in these situations. And again, like that compassionate family member or loved one might be like, just leave. Why are you going back? It's really hard, I think, to sometimes put ourselves in the shoes of somebody who's in that relationship, even if, like, I imagine as an expert in this area, you have a lot of compassion and can empathize and understand, and still, like, you can't fully understand every single person's unique journey because they're a unique person with their own journey. So we can empathize and try to support people. What might you encourage me to say, or somebody in that position who wants to really support their loved one? What would you recommend we say in those moments?
The first thing I always recommend is to strike the question, why don't you just leave, from the vocabulary? The reality is, we know that that question does nothing but induce shame, which actually makes it more likely that somebody is going to stay in an abusive relationship. So if you get nothing else out of anything today, I just ask you to please strike that question of why don't you just leave from your vocabulary. Instead, much more effective things to do are to provide support, provide a listening ear. It can be hard to hear that somebody you love is being hurt. So if you don't think you're in a place that you can be able to handle that, first off, acknowledge that to that person. Don't feel like you have to sit there and white knuckle through their conversation, because the person who's experiencing the unhealthy relationship behaviors is going to pick up on that. And then they're going to wonder how genuine they were. And they're going to sit there and question, did they disclose too much? What should they have done differently, etc. So if you don't feel you're in a place to be able to handle that information, just communicate that and say, hey, I'm not sure that now is the right time, or I'm not sure I'm the best person to be able to express that. I want you to know I'm for you. I want to be able to provide the support that you need, but I don't know that I can handle the details of that right now. That would be a healthy way to communicate that. I do think it's important for people to be aware that a lot of the resources that do currently exist for being able to help individuals who are experiencing unhealthy relationship behaviors are actually found more at your state level than the national level. Now, there are some great national ones that do exist. Like I mentioned, the National Domestic Violence Hotline, Maine, which is also a great resource for those who are experiencing familial type domestic violence or sexual violence. But I do encourage you to figure out what might be the resources that would be valuable at your state level. There are so many different states have different resources that are available and would be useful depending on the situation.
You mentioned earlier that one of the most dangerous times can be when somebody's leaving a relationship. And I'm wondering, even before then, are there certain phases in a relationship where these behaviors start or increase or change over time?
We know that domestic violence can happen at any point in a relationship, and I think it's really important to call that out. Oftentimes, people assume domestic violence doesn't start until well into the relationship. In fact, I often hear from individuals that abuse didn't start until they were married. If we go back and if we look at some of those early relationship red flags that we highlighted earlier, we actually know that domestic violence can start at any period of time. Now, there is a well-researched cycle of domestic violence. We have what we call the period of tension, the tension build. And during that particular period, that's where a lot of people report experiencing that hypervigilance, that walking on eggshellsy feeling, like that feeling that they know something is going to happen, but they don't know what. And then we get, I call it the boom, but what would be known as the abusive incident. Something happened. And then oftentimes we'll see the honeymoon cycle. And in the honeymoon cycle, this is where you'll hear things like, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean it. I'll go to therapy, I'll fix it. And then oftentimes we'll go right back into that tension build, and then to another boom, and then another honeymoon. But as I said earlier, in the spectrum of covert to overt domestic violence, oftentimes in the really early part of a relationship, we will see that boom looks a lot more like the covert types of abuse. And it's a lot harder for individuals to be able to pick up and go, oh, that wasn't okay. So I think that it's important to call that particular cycle out.
I imagine that sometimes it's hard to recognize the cycle until it's happened several times. Like it's hard to notice, especially if we're the ones, like if you're in the cycle yourself, if you're listening to this and you're like, oh man, I didn't even notice that maybe that pattern is happening. Like having compassion for yourself, that it's hard for us to see things when we're in them sometimes. That's why like therapy exists, right? Because it's hard for us to notice these patterns ourselves. I really appreciate all of this thoughtful information that you've given us, and just knowing that we're like scratching the surface here of all the resources that are out there and all of the different possibilities of layers of what the intimate partner violence relationships could look like. Stacey and I really appreciate all of the thoughtful, layered, contextual, complex information that you've shared about this topic, and the fact that we've really only scratched the surface here because there's so many unique and the fact that we've only scratched the surface here because there's so many unique ways that domestic violence and intimate partner violence relationships can unfold. I'm curious, what would you encourage people to take with them from today? Like, what might be a key takeaway?
So if you are experiencing domestic violence, there are two key takeaways from today. Number one is you're not alone. Domestic violence incredibly common. As I mentioned earlier, it is prevalent in every population on this earth. So please know that you're not alone. Number two is help is available, whether it be through hotlines, whether it be through advocacy agencies, whether it be through shelters, whether it be through therapy. Please know help is available. For somebody who has a loved one who's experiencing domestic violence, the key takeaway, as I mentioned earlier, the one thing that if you get nothing else out of is to strike that question of why don't you just leave?
We really appreciate having you here and you sharing this thoughtful information with us. And if you've been listening to this today and this topic resonated with you, please share it with somebody that you care about. Also, please comment, like, and subscribe. You can listen to our podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple. You also can message us on YouTube, Facebook, or LinkedIn with suggestions of questions you'd like us to discuss in future episodes. And also, please remember that there are resources linked in the description of this video for you or a loved one if you have resonated with any of the information that's been shared today.